Welcome everyone once again. Let's talk about politics and governance. And today we talk about an article that has been a lot of visibility online lately, and with good reason. It's about how the US is using its influence over the semiconductor supply chains to limit Chinese tech growth. But it's also about the difficulty of getting foreign companies, especially German ones, to comply with this. And so I have invited Julian Germann to explore this topic. And Julian will show us how the German semiconductor firms are trying to dodge US export controls despite their reliance on US tech. And this is partly due to their strong connections with the German's auto industry, which is deeply involved with the Chinese market. So let's look into it. Julian, welcome to our episode.
Thank you for having me.
So Julian, the role of the German semiconductor firms and their responses to US export controls are not well explored, you say in the article, even though Germany has a strategic position on this. And of course, these firms are critical. So tell us more about what drove this research.
Yeah, so as you've very nicely summarized, we find that there's been a lot of talk about the US-China chip war, about the US trying to restrict China's access to advanced semiconductors. And the US can basically do this in two ways. They can exert diplomatic pressure, as they've done with regards to the Netherlands, with regards to Japan, to compel these governments to follow US export restrictions with national legislation. But they can also try to write rules that are supposed to apply globally to all semiconductor firms. That's what's called extraterritorial export controls. And they've been trying to do this also with a number of firms. And what we find is that some of the big firms, ASML in the Netherlands, Tokyo Electron in Japan, TSMC in Taiwan, have been the subject of some inquiries. But we do find that German companies in particular have been flying under the radar a little bit. These key companies make some critical components that China needs to make the most advanced chips and cannot easily make on its own without these components, without these tools, without these materials. But what we do find is that we don't really know exactly who these German firms are, and we don't really know how they are responding to US pressures. So what we were really excited about is that we have access to some powerful commercial data sets which really haven't been fully explored for this kind of research. So with these data sets, we can basically map the operations, we can map the connections of world-leading semiconductor firms. So we thought, here's an opportunity to use these data sets to shed new light on key German firms that are important but haven't received a lot of critical attention yet.
Okay, and now we are excited to know. So when you looked at these commercial data sets, what did you find? So what are the most important highlights of what you found?
Yeah, so the big surprise overall, the headline message, as you've already described it, is that German semiconductor firms are resisting US efforts to cut off China. And this is interesting for several reasons. It's interesting, first of all, because these German firms aren't actually more dependent on the Chinese market than companies in other countries like Japan or South Korea, where we do find evidence that at least some firms from these countries are more willing to go along with US restrictions, right? Even though they have similar levels of business with China. So that's a bit of a puzzle, right? That leads us then to identify about a dozen semiconductor firms in Germany that we call China choke point firms, in the sense that, as I've said, they make materials, they make components, they make tools that China needs to build advanced semiconductors. And we then zoom in on three of these chip firms at different segments or different stages of the semiconductor supply chain. What we find based on the data sets that we've got is that they all rely heavily on US technology. They also rely on the United States as a key location for supplier facilities, also as a key location for US customers. So customers are buying from German firms. So all of these are what we call heavily techno-dependent on the United States. And yet, if we look at how these companies have been acting, they still are finding ways to keep selling to China. So for example, Merck is one of those companies that we looked at. It's responding to US export controls by localizing more production in China. Siemens famously dragged its feet on cutting ties with some problematic Chinese distributors. And Süss Microtech, which is another so-called hidden champion, self-styled hidden champion in the semiconductor industry, is expanding in Taiwan in large part to get around the tighter restrictions that German officials have imposed, presumably at the behest of the United States. So here's the overall puzzle that we established on the basis of these three case studies. So in order to resolve it, we need to dig deeper. And it turns out that when we look at Germany's chip companies, we find that they're closely tied to Germany's car industry. And of course, we know that Germany's car makers are hugely dependent on selling cars to China. And that creates what we call a secondary exposure for the German chip sector, so that they're not just thinking about their own business with China when they make these decisions, they're also thinking about the potential impact on Germany's crucial automotive sector.
Makes sense. And you were mentioning these firms that you focused on that rely on US stack as as a key location for supply facilities for customers. So these findings complicate, in my opinion, US efforts to control this China stack development. So the US are probably the ones who are interested in learning from these, as their strategies might need to adapt a bit maybe in the future. So what do you say are the most important lessons of these findings, and who can learn from them?
Yeah, I mean, our focus really is on German and an extension on European policymakers. We think that our research has significant implications for them. This particular study, with regards to the next year or so, I would say, is really important because the US, as I've said before, has been trying to control what foreign companies can sell to China by making rules that are supposed to apply globally. But what we find is that, at least for German companies, this approach really hasn't worked well so far. So what's likely going to happen? Well, whoever ends up as the next US president is likely going to need to be putting a lot more pressure directly on the German government. They will very likely push very hard for Germany to accept and adopt the same kind of export controls that the US has in place right now, right? So they're going to try to go this diplomatic channel of enormous pressure, depending on who will be the president, leveraging particular kind of vulnerabilities of Europe and of Germany here. So things are going to get very heated. And we think that this is significant because everybody in European capitals, certainly, and including Brussels, including Berlin, has been talking about de-risking from China. But our research, in a way, is a kind of wake-up call to say to policymakers, don't forget about the enormous risks that are associated with US policies in this chip war as well.
You said a few minutes ago that on this topic, that we need to dig deeper. And so let's circle back to that. What should researchers pay attention next? Looking deeply or to more data set commercials or potential implications for European companies if US sanctions extend to other sectors? So what's ahead of us now academically?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, our research team, the co-authors of this particular policy paper, we're also looking at, the particular article. We are also looking currently at other key players in the chip world, and we're interested in how they are handling growing pressures from the United States. So firms like TSMC in Taiwan, as I've said, Tokyo Electron in Japan, ASML in the Netherlands, these are really powerful corporations, and we need to know much more about them because we think that their capabilities and also their choices are going to shape the extent to which governments can resist being dragged into what we think is a very dangerous technological and geopolitical rivalry between the United States and China. And of course, you're right, it's not limited to the chip sector. There are escalating measures that the United States is taking in other high-tech sectors, from aerospace and defense to advanced battery manufacturing to biotechnology. And so the broader those export controls are getting, the more companies are going to be involved in this, and the more governments all over the world are going to be involved in this.
You mentioned that things are, this still getting is going to get very heated soon, probably with a new presidency and some new pressure on German companies. And this field is evolving fast. We actually had another episode about this topic a few episodes ago, and we have books and articles coming out regularly about semiconductors and this rivalry between the US and China. So for you, who are an expert on this topic and you've studied this, what are your most relevant reflections and predictions about this topic for you?
I mean, you've already hinted at this. I think the key issue is that our study suggests that there's huge potential for a massive escalation in US enforcement. We have seen the United States over the past 2 years push its legal reach way beyond its national borders. There's one chip component where the US is basically saying, we don't care where it's made, we don't care who makes it, we don't care how it's made, we don't care if it embodies any US technology or any US inputs. No company anywhere in the world is allowed to sell this to China, period. That is a huge deal, right? That's like the US trying to set very restrictive rules for the entire global chip industry. And our research suggests that for this to actually work, the US cannot just continue to pass more rules. They also have to demonstrate that they are willing and able to enforce them. So we're not just talking about diplomatic pressure here, which I've talked about previously. We're also talking about potentially economic penalties against firms from allied companies. So the big question is, how far is the US going to escalate this? How much would this affect relationships with allies? So it's really fascinating for me. That's the big question that I think is fascinating to see how this is going to play out.
Yeah, and how far can the US go to escalate on this? It's a great punchline actually for this episode. But if you had to sum up this whole episode to close this, summing it up in no more than 2 sentences, what would it be?
It's that the chip war between the United States and China is the perfect test case for seeing how far the US is actually able to reshape globalization in ways that counter the interests of powerful firms and of key allies. So if you want to understand the nature and future of global power, then the chip war is the place you want to keep an eye on.
Perfect. Julian, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So for all of those who are watching us on YouTube, you can just browse to scroll down to the description of the video, where you can find all the resources, all the materials of this conversation, the article that Julian and colleagues published and we just discussed, and you can find the links to all the resources important to you, as well as our Twitter account, our newsletter, and some other materials that might be relevant for follow-up.